Welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining. We are here. My name is Joel Balamchwan. I'm with the Supportive Housing Network of New York. We appreciate you joining today for this briefing, the briefing on the Mayor Adams City of Yes Housing Opportunity Proposal. We have a wonderful team from New York City Department of City Planning. And before I pass it off to them, I just want to say that this is really an opportunity for our members to engage with this plan. We want to hear your questions. And so we have the Q&A function in the webinar. Please put your questions there and ask many questions. We'll have the presentation and then ample time for questions. So we really want to hear from you as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming, and I will pass it off to John Mangan. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here to present our housing opportunity text amendments. I think it's basically the farthest reaching set of pro-housing proposals that we've ever done in New York City. And so we're happy to talk to everybody about it. I'm from the Housing Division. I'm joined by Veronica Brown, Winnie Shen, and Sam Levy. Veronica and Winnie will be presenting, and Sam and I will be here to help with questions that Winnie and Veronica aren't able to answer. So enjoy.
Thank you, John. So I'm just skip the intro. So I'm Winnie, and I'm joined by Veronica, and we're excited to share our ideas on City of Housing Opportunity, and also to have this opportunity to engage in dialogue with you all to get your input. So for just some high-level framing, here are the main goals we hope to achieve with City of Housing Opportunity. Our proposal ideas are grounded into the proposals laid out in the Housing Blueprint, which is Mayor Adams' blueprint on how to tackle New York's affordable housing crisis, based on the feedback received from a citywide survey, including unhoused and formerly unhoused New Yorkers. On top of that, it's also based on ideas laid out in Where We Live in New York City, which is the city's fair housing report published by HPD, which was also a result of a lot of community feedback from organizations and public meetings across the city. Essentially want to simplify our existing zoning regulations to facilitate equitable housing development, and in a way that results in gradual incremental change citywide. So every neighborhood can do its part to meet our city's housing needs. So we're talking to you very early in the process before we start to draft zoning text for the proposals themselves. And we're sharing our current ideas as they stand to answer your questions and to gather your feedback. To structure our conversation today, we've grouped our proposal into these three categories: proposals that affect areas of medium and high density, those that affect low density areas, and finally our parking proposals, which will be applicable citywide. And the map on the right shows where exactly those residence districts are. In blue are our low density R1 to R5 districts, and in orange are medium to high density R6 to R10 districts. To start us off, we'll be looking at the medium and high density proposals first. And this is one we're particularly excited about, as it'll create a path to developing more affordable and supportive housing that would benefit New Yorkers, especially the communities that your group serves. And we're looking to give all supportive and affordable housing the same preferential FAR already given to affordable senior housing developments in our medium to high density R6 to R10 districts across the city. And again, the map highlights in orange where those districts are. And in districts where there is no AIRS bump, or the AIRS FAR is only a small increase over the district's base FAR, we propose creating higher FARs for affordable and supportive housing. By doing so, we'll not be changing the existing zoning and just uplifting affordable and supportive housing by allowing those developments to produce more of the housing that New Yorkers most need. Next, we're looking at how to ease conversions of obsolete underutilized buildings to housing. The Office of Adaptive Reuse Task Force, which is a private public task force of 12 members, recently released a report outlining recommendations that we're aiming to implement and build on. Under current zoning regulations, only buildings that meet certain age and geography criteria are allowed to convert from non-residential to residential under more lenient requirements that would otherwise be possible. We're looking to expand the universe of eligible buildings by changing the age threshold buildings must meet and to broaden the geographic applicability. Additionally, we want to allow conversion to a wider range of housing types, including supportive housing. To achieve this, we're looking to adjust regulations like open space requirements and dwelling unit factor. Through adjustments to these regulations, we be able to facilitate more conversions, such as the one pictured where Breaking Ground converted a former hotel into supportive housing, and creating more of the affordable and supportive housing the city needs. Next, another goal is to eliminate zoning barriers to create new housing. Here pictured is a building filled with simple no-frill studios. Although New York has many such buildings, you wouldn't need to build one today because of minimum average unit size requirements. By not providing this variety of housing options, people must find roommates to afford rent or are forced into potentially unstable living arrangements in order to secure housing. We want to change that and instead encourage housing types that serve everyone, which will also help to relieve pressure on family size units elsewhere in the city. We're also in talks with HPD to discuss how to support potential new shared housing models. And these are housing models that are previously prohibited because of historical prejudice and exclusionary zoning practices. Another proposal we're looking into is removing zoning regulations that prevent campus sites from adding new housing units. Residential campuses that may have considerable development rights available to them are prevented from making full use because of our existing regulations. Firstly, many campuses have buildings that don't comply with quality housing regulations, preventing them from accessing quality housing bulk regulations. And for campuses in lower density districts, requirements like yard and height prohibit these buildings from fully utilizing their FAR. Lastly, our zoning has a stricter requirement for minimum distance between buildings than what New York State multiple dwelling law requires, which further eliminates infill development. And through these changes, we can allow for the creation of more diverse housing types and create the opportunity for campus developments to add more housing. And I guess before we switch over to our low density proposals, we can take any clarifying questions that have come up.
Doesn't look like there are any questions in the chat function or the Q&A function, but people can continue to submit those. And I think John and Sam can answer like via text, or we can answer when I'm done.
Okay, perfect. All right, then I'll switch to Veronica.
Great. So before we get into the proposals for low density areas, we want to provide a little background about these neighborhoods, especially since this is the first time in decades that we're making significant zoning changes and introducing new housing opportunities to the low density parts of New York City. For the past year and a half, we've been doing qualitative and quantitative research into the city's 1-family, 2-family, and low density multifamily districts. This research has revealed a few key findings upon which our proposals are premised. So first and foremost, increasingly restrictive zoning has made it very difficult to build housing in the low density areas. These exclusionary rules have effectively allowed some neighborhoods to opt out of addressing the city's growing housing needs. In our analysis, we've also identified 2 key issues with the current zoning that our proposals are going to aim to address. So first, although 12 of the 18 low density zoning districts claim to allow more than a single family home, whether that's a duplex or a small apartment building, overlapping regulations such as yards, FAR, height limits, and parking often mean that only a single family home can be achieved on a typical site. This means both that a vacant site can only become a single family home and that homeowners in 2-family districts cannot actually add a second unit to their single family home. Second, because much of the city's housing stock was developed before the 1961 zoning resolution, there's a wide variety of building types in the low density areas, even though the zoning currently dictates homogeneous streetscapes with limited housing types. We realize that the real world variety of housing types, completely unrecognized by our current zoning resolution, ranges from large apartment buildings in the short end of the block to small accessory dwelling units in single family backyards or in basements. Next slide, please. So first, we aim to address the overlapping zoning barriers such as yards, FAR, parking, and other regulations that are currently interacting to make it impossible to build anything other than a 1-family house on many low density lots, even when they are technically zoned for 2-family or multifamily buildings. So for example, R41 districts are 2-family districts that allow semi-detached buildings like the ones you see in this image. But buildings like these pre-1961 duplexes could not be constructed today because they would encroach upon the required rear yard. Fixing these zoning rules has the potential to add a significant amount of housing to the low density areas, since in 2-family and low density multifamily districts, there are currently a large number of single family homes. Again, this part of the proposal doesn't allow housing types beyond what is nominally allowed in those districts today. It only removes the exclusionary rules that have been layered onto these districts over time. Next slide, please. In our second suite of proposals for low density districts, we want to reintroduce housing types that our restrictive zoning currently prohibits. And we want to do so in places that make sense based on both the existing built form and the goals of the project. So in commercial overlays, we're looking at allowing mixed use apartment buildings as of right. In order to build a viable apartment building with a commercial ground floor, like what's on the right side of this image, These areas would need, for example, more FAR and more height, as well as reduced parking requirements. These changes could allow for new buildings that match the existing condition in some of the low-density areas' most successful commercial corridors. And they could also extend this type of mixed-use development to areas where it's missing, like on Staten Island, which would benefit from a town center model. Not only would this strategy reallow a building type that's already present and that people know and like, it also has the realistic potential to introduce significant housing opportunities that are relatively cheap to build. Outside of commercial overlays, so in our low-density residence districts, we propose allowing apartment buildings on sites that meet specific criteria. Lots on the short end of the block or on a wide street near transit could be afforded additional FAR, height, modified yard requirements, and other allowances that would enable apartment buildings on large lots. Our analysis shows us that existing density is already located at these kinds of locations. Apartment buildings in low-density areas are disproportionately located on the short ends of the block, for example. So allowing new apartment buildings there could mirror the successful organic development in place from before our current zoning. This part of the proposal is also critical to introducing new housing options across the city, as the goals of this project note that every neighborhood should contribute to addressing the city's housing needs. And this would introduce multifamily housing in a range of neighborhoods beyond only where commercial overlays are mapped. Next slide, please. As our final proposal for the low density districts, we plan to create an ADU program through which a 1 or 2 family building in a low density district can add an additional unit. The crux of this proposal is defining something in the zoning called an accessory dwelling unit, which would be separate from a dwelling unit. This means that it won't count towards the maximum number of dwelling units in any given zoning district. So 1-family homes in 1-family districts would be allowed to add ADUs, which would introduce new housing units to these areas and serve different income levels and household types that a single-family home does. These units would also receive other forms of zoning relief. So for example, an ADU would not have any parking requirement. On a separate track from the regulations that are aimed at the creation of new ADUs, we'll pursue possible zoning changes that would be necessary to support the legalization of existing units. These changes will largely be dependent on changes to other laws at the state and local level that are the primary obstacle to legalization today. Next slide, please. So finally, I'm going to present our proposal for parking in both the high and low density areas. These changes are very exciting because they represent a significant shift, not only away from current parking policy, but also from our existing parking framework. Instead of being tied to zoning districts, we're going to base parking requirements on proximity to transit. Our research shows us that transit access has a pronounced effect on car usage. We have an existing geography that cover the parts of the city with the best transit access, which we call the transit zone, and is shown here in purple, in light purple. Today, there are no parking requirements for affordable housing in the transit zone. Now, we want to do the same for all types of housing, making parking completely optional within the transit zone. It would still be allowed, but it wouldn't be required, which removes parking as a limiting factor in the development of housing in transit-rich areas. Outside of the transit zone, our parking requirements are currently very high. Generally, we require 1 space per unit in the low-density districts, and the zoning does not acknowledge the differences in transit access that actually affect auto dependency in these areas. We want to create a new geography just beyond the transit zone, where there is still good access to transit, and we think parking minimums can be deeply reduced, prioritizing the development of housing over the provision of parking in transit-oriented areas. Outside of that geography, we'll reduce parking minimums to a lesser degree. While we acknowledge that these parts of the city are more auto-oriented than areas near transit, our research shows us that current parking requirements are outpacing actual car ownership rates, meaning we're mandating an oversupply of parking. Okay, so that sums up all of our proposals about high density, low density, and parking. So I think now we'll take any questions about any aspect of the proposal, which I'm not seeing any in the Q&A, but take some time to type them, I guess.
I think I saw one from Rebecca, and I'm not sure who all gets to see the chat. It may have just gone to a few of us rather than the larger group, about what type of campuses we're talking about in this proposal. And we're thinking about campuses above 1.5 acres, which is a standard that already exists in the zoning, which defines the threshold above which you can be a large scale development. And typically the types of the campuses we see are NYCHA campuses, Mitchell-Lama campuses, or campuses that were created pursuant to some other state or local law, like limited dividend housing corporations, things like that. And we would propose on those types of campuses to relax some of the regulations that prevent infill, even in instances where there are, prime development sites on those campuses. I hope that answers your question, Rebecca.
I'm seeing 2 questions in the Q&A. Are you able to see those, John?
I am. Veronica and Winnie, can you see those as well?
Yeah, so I see a question from Claudia. Will these changes require amendments to individual zoning districts, or will it be a larger change that will be applied to all districts? It is assumed that the former strategy would take a long time to implement. Okay, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, like this won't be a change which requires the mapping of new districts. This will be a change to the zoning text that will change what the underlying districts can do today. So as soon as the text is changed, those changes will take effect, like whatever the text allows would be allowed as of that moment. It wouldn't require the mapping of new districts for those things to be applicable. So hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to ask for follow-up. Sam, do you have something to add? It says you would like to answer the question live.
No, I was just marking it as answered.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So next question, could you explain more about the shared housing models that once existed that this proposal aims to bring back, and the provision about enabling apartments to be smaller in medium or high density? So we're looking at changes to the dwelling unit factor that would allow apartments that, in certain areas to be, you could have an apartment building where all of the units are studios, which is not achievable today because of our onerous dwelling unit factors. So we think this allows like sort of a wide range of housing that meets, single person households needs, as well as alleviate some of the pressure on family size units that exist today when single person households have to band together and live in a family-sized unit. Our research is showing us that that's happening in certain neighborhoods. We're looking at that now, where that's taking place. And so we think that there is a need that would be met by allowing small apartments, buildings that consist of only small apartments, which is formerly allowed. If someone else wants to take the shared housing models part of the question, that'd be good. So it's HPD sort of questions.
Sure. I can try to answer that. I just, like Veronica and Winnie said in the presentation, the view of shared housing models, like SROs and other types of shared housing, we don't really share the same view of those that we had in the 1950s. And I think that the opinion about those types of models is changing, not only at city planning or among the administration, but we've heard a lot about that from certain council members as well, looking to try to just broaden the range of housing typologies that we offer in neighborhoods around the city to ensure that everybody has a place to live. HPD has been working on shared housing models that would be supported by HPD programs, I would say, for the last 5 or so years. In that time, I would say the interest has broadened as well to exploring shared housing models that wouldn't be, subject to HPD programming and oversight. And so folks are looking into that as well at this point. And that could be, living situations where individuals rent a room with a bathroom and there's a shared kitchen or something like that, or any type of arrangement where where the unit isn't entirely contained with full cooking and sanitary facilities. And so I don't think that we have definitive conclusions yet on either what that would look like or whether it would be limited to HPD supported projects or expanded beyond that. But those work streams are happening now, and we expect them to the timing to work for our broader proposals that we'll introduce in 2024.
I can quickly answer one of Quincy's questions about will building separation distance be relaxed on campuses? So yes, that's one of the current regulations that we're looking at relaxing to facilitate campus development, which is like distance between buildings, because again, what our zoning requires is stricter than what the New York State multiple dwelling law requires. And it wouldn't just be for NYCHA campuses, it would be for all residential campuses.
Then we have a question from Ariel about feedback from community boards about parking requirement reductions, particularly in the outer boroughs. So we are going to be going to community boards in the future, but we have started, extensive outreach to groups like your own and other interested stakeholders. And so we have heard, a lot of feedback about parking requirements. And we do recognize, as I mentioned, our strategy aims to recognize that there are some places in the outer boroughs in which there is a more auto-oriented lifestyle, and that we are aiming to structure our parking requirements along the factors that actually affect auto dependence rather than the somewhat arbitrary nature today of them being tied to zoning districts. So we welcome that feedback in general, and are trying to, create a parking proposal where we prioritize housing over parking, but we also recognize the lived reality of the outer boroughs and other parts of the city.
And I'll just add one more thing. We've talked to, I think, like 35 or 36 council members about this at this point already as well. That's not the community boards, but they are folks who represent those parts of the city. I would say that in equal measure, we've heard folks say, "Oh, you're going to have trouble with those reducing parking in those farther flung neighborhoods," and folks who are like, "This doesn't go far enough. Why don't you just eliminate all parking requirements?" So, I hope that we can just sort of navigate right down the middle and get significant parking reductions and simplifications, while at the same time, as Veronica says, recognizing the lived realities of certain parts of the city.
I think that's related to a question from Walt that's about media reports of communities that want to fight rezonings. And given the housing needs, how will the pushback be managed by communities that do not want high density or supportive housing projects? Well, so as I've mentioned, we're going out, early and often to talk to as many people as possible. But also, I think the driving force of this project is that we want every community to do its part in providing housing, which would hopefully address people's concerns that any single community would experience radical change or be sort of overburdened by a production of any type of housing. We want, incremental change spread across the entire city, which we think will lead to the best outcomes. So hopefully that is a persuasive argument to those communities that are ready to fight us. Okay, let me read some more questions.
I can speak to Peggy's question. Maybe John can fill in. So can you expand on FAR regulations relative to supportive and affordable housing? Will there be an FAR increase for such housing over market rate developments? So what we're proposing is right now, so there's AIR's FAR for medium high density districts. They have a preferential FAR over those base districts FAR, but that's only limited to senior affordable. It's age restricted affordable housing that get access to that preference. So the idea is that we just want to extend that preference to all affordable and supportive housing developments. And in areas where like that AIR's FAR isn't a very significant increase over the base FAR, we're looking into extending, giving a slight bump just for the top of FAR. John, yeah, if you can fill in anything I'm missing.
Sure. And beyond that, I mean, folks in this meeting will know that there are some zoning districts where supportive housing can access an FAR even higher than the affordable senior FAR, like in your R6s, your R72s, R9s. You can do that, but only through a special permit, which means full ULURP, which takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money. In conjunction with the top-up proposal, we also propose to maintain those existing higher FARs in certain districts, your R6s, your R72s, your R9s, while reducing the amount of process from a full ULURP to an authorization, which would mean a 30 or 60-day referral to the community board and then a vote by the commission and you're done. And in conjunction with sort of pre-certification or pre-referral streamlining, we think that that will just be a much better situation for folks looking to develop supportive housing in R6, in R72, in R9 over the current situation where, there's a project, I think in Harlem we dealt with recently that it took, 2 years to access that higher FAR. Here under the proposals here, you could get that done a lot more quickly. Okay, what's next? Okay, Claudia asked, in certain districts, the FAR for NPISA is reduced significantly from what is allowed for other community facilities. Is this restriction being looked at as well? That's basically the question that I just answered. In those districts, your community facility with sleeping is limited to an FAR significantly below the FAR for community facilities without sleeping. For instance, in an R6, your NPISA would be limited to 2.43, even though other community facilities like schools and things like that can get up to 4.8 as of right. Today, your NPISA, your community facility with sleeping could access that 4.8, but only through a full ULURP, through a special permit. And we propose to enable access to that 4.8 for a supportive housing development through mere authorization. So significantly reducing the amount of procedure necessary to get there. And we've been talking to other agencies as well, and are committed also to implementing pre-referral procedure reform so that you can get from the drawing board to referral for your authorization to access the higher FAR more quickly than you can today.
I can take this question about ADUs. Someone's asking, they live in a pre-war building with 2 residential units, a ground floor commercial space, and an attached garage. Would the garage be able to convert to an ADU as of right, or would the commercial space? So I think the exact details of our accessory dwelling unit program are still being worked out. So in terms of, whether this specific site would qualify for conversion, I think would, depend on a variety of factors that are probably not, I can't answer on the spot. But I think that in general, I'll say we're exploring a variety of typologies, which definitely include garage conversions, as well as converting an internal part of your structure. So in this case, that was the commercial space, but also you could have a attached accessory dwelling unit that's not an attached garage if you were to convert part of a 1 or 2 unit building into a separate unit that would be an ADU in the low density districts. So yeah, I think hopefully in general that answers your question.
I should have asked this before, but are we able to make these slides available to folks? Can we share them? I mean, I will also say, we're recording this, we're going to be sharing it with our wider membership so that everyone, can see, but can we share the slides as well?
I think so. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully that answers your question, Walt. Hi, Walt. Thank you so much for answering our many questions. Do folks have any other questions? Well,
I think I've got another one here. Are you guys seeing? I've heard of pushback from council members on increasing the number of studios in a congregate setting in high density areas or in areas with disproportionate numbers of supportive units already. They would prefer 2 to 3 bedrooms for their community. Have you gotten any otherwise positive feedback or in certain areas? I would say that the reaction to this proposal has had a geographic factor, that in parts of the city that are lower income or that are in areas that face gentrification pressures from, these groups of, younger folks and sort of outbidding families for family size units. In those areas, council members and borough presidents have expressed some concern about enabling developments with smaller units. Well, on the contrary, we've heard from folks in more central locations, council members there, an openness to enabling developments with greater numbers of smaller units and sort of the most central locations that have the best access to jobs and transit and things like that. So reaction has been varied. We are also looking with our population division on like what types of households occupy family size units in different neighborhoods around the city, in part to try to tell the story that, the reason why family units come under pressure in some of those, more gentrifying areas or lower income areas, is because we're forcing, folks to band together, people, households with multiple incomes to band together, and they typically can outbid, a mother with 2 kids or something like that for a family size unit. And so that, a major thrust of this effort is really to try to free up family size units for households that actually need them, and to enable the many people in New York City who would like to live alone but can't, to give them housing options as well. A lot of people who are banded together with roommates in gentrifying parts of the city, are banded together unhappily and would rather just be living alone somewhere else. And so that's all part of the kind of balanced strategy to increase the housing typologies available, so that we can help create a housing market that works for everybody.
We have a question from Quincy about, will DCP be adjusting the lower density zones to allow for multiple dwelling law? For example, would you allow 3 dwelling units in an R3A district, which is a 2-family district? So our hope with the accessory dwelling unit program is that the accessory dwelling unit, by being distinct from a dwelling unit, would not count towards MDL, meaning that, let's say you have a 2-family building in an R3A district, a 2-family district, both the zoning, would allow for that accessory dwelling unit in that 2-family district, but also that 3rd unit, because it's an accessory dwelling unit, would not trigger MDL by being a 3rd unit. There's also in R3A, just like in terms of what else we would allow in a 2-family district, the qualifying sites program I mentioned, that in sites that are near transit that meet other criteria, such as a certain lot size, being on a short end of the block or a wide street, could also build a building that's an apartment building, so more than 2 units on a large site.
So yeah, definitely one of the biggest aspects of this proposal in the lower density districts is to enable multifamily in one form or another throughout the full range of lower density districts, whether that's through ADUs or through, enabling multifamily within commercial districts in low density areas, or the qualifying sites criteria. It will newly open opportunities for multifamily in those districts, where appropriate. And those tend to be the types of sites where we see multifamily in those districts today. They were just built prior to 1961. I'm seeing another question on, is HPD looking at micro units? Though allowed by code and zoning, HPD seems reluctant to approve them as a model. Like we've said, HPD is looking at various typologies, various forms of shared housing. I think the term micro unit has fallen out of favor a little bit, but definitely no frills studios, and definitely shared housing. Individuals would rent a bedroom, most likely with a bathroom attached, and share certain other types of facilities. So HPD is very much looking at these.
Just giving it a minute to see if there's any more questions that come in. Gonna put the general email for the text amendment for everyone here that you had shared earlier, Veronica. So that's now in the chat for everyone to see. Any other questions from folks? Also feel free to email, after the fact. We can always end a few minutes early, give people back some of their time if there's not any more questions. Any other things that you all wanted to say or share with folks? Okay, well, with that, I think it looks like the Q&A has slowed down, but the network is always here to answer any further questions or forward any questions. I see the attendees, you likely have our email addresses. We know you well. And so, just reach out to us. And then we put the general email in the chat. We really, really appreciate you folks joining us. Thank you so much, Winnie, Veronica, John, Sam. Thank you so much for doing this for our members and for continuing to be a resource. We really appreciate it.